Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. There are fast-moving currents of change in India. They involve a powerful yet silent migration of millions from village to town, from rural identities to urban uncertainties. The change that is occurring belies images of timeless and static ancestral patterns, and adds yet another layer of complexity to an India that is itself caught up in enormous forces of economic change and political aspiration. The questions raised range from when and how change means progress to what are the real implications of globalization for emerging economies. My guest is Dipankar Gupta, professor of sociology at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. Dipankar, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you here, and let me risk a kind of a personal view on our subject, India and change. I have the notion that there's no country in the world that's more romantically viewed than India. And when people think of India or speak of it, the adjectives you hear employed are always millennial, ancestral, timeless patterns, and probably the example most cited is that of village life.
Yes.
But I think that your work and the things you are writing now focus on change we may be missing because of that, and perhaps the agrarian conservative identity of the village is changing. Do you agree with that assessment, and if so,
No,
why?
absolutely. I think changes are taking place, and some of them are really quite important and remarkable changes. The fact that India has been mystified as this, land of spiritual tradition and so forth, has done us a lot of damage, I think, in terms of understanding Indian reality.
Right.
Because every time we see a problem, we say, well, Indians are involved in the afterlife more than this life, and so what does it matter if there are some poor people dying? I think in India, the scholars have always mentioned in one form or the other for the last 50 years or so that changes are taking place in rural India. But they mention these changes occurring at a very slow and incremental fashion. And yet, the surprising part is that when one wants them to conceptualize village India, they fall back on the same old tired notions of, unchanging village or caste-ridden village or whatever.
Right.
So while things are noticed in part, the parts don't add up. And what I've been trying to do is to add up those parts. And in adding them up, one finds a completely new story emerging.
That's fascinating. Is a large part of the story and a large part of the things to be added up concentrated in the phenomenon of migration, that is to say, the movement of people out of the village for one reason or another?
Well, migration is the one thing which is very important, but I think the more important thing is what is happening to the village economy.
Those who stay in the village.
I think the village economy, what's happening to that, unless we know that, we can't figure out what's happening to those who are in the village, in conditions of extreme poverty, and people who leave the village for an uncertain life in the cities.
So what is happening within the village? I mean, for example, when I think of the village, I'm sure once again the romantic notion is of people in agrarian patterns.
Well, yes.
Farm jobs.
Yeah, but villages in India are really quite in quite a lot of distress. A few figures might help. Today in India, 85% of all holdings are below 5 acres.
That's small.
That's very small. And if you go by my impression, it's probably 3.5 to 4 acres. Because when I go to Indian villages, I rarely come across a substantial landowner. What has happened is over time, because of our inheritance laws, there have been subdivisions of holdings. So what may have once begun in 1950 or 40, as a 500-acre or 400-acre land, over time, the plot has been subdivided. So now, the person has 3 or 4 acres. He has a memory of the days when they were rich and powerful people. But today, they don't have much money.
Well, that's striking to me because, quite frankly, my image was of the great landowner and equivalent of many
that's
workers.
what I thought too. When I went out to the villages in the mid-80s, I was primed by books of this kind, that the big landowners who were rapacious and who flogged the peasants and the poorer farmers, and I didn't see them. So initially I thought that maybe I was doing something wrong. And when I came back and looked at the census reports, they were quite helpful, but not very helpful, because some of the census reports, I think, were also quite misleading. And so I did a study of my own. I did a village door-to-door census of 3 villages, and I found that indeed there weren't any, or very few, 1 or 2 here and there, farmers who had something like 30 or 35 acres,
Right.
but not more than that. The bulk of the farmers were very poor, marginal farmers. And this is the problem, you see. Because if you have 85% below 5 acres or 4 acres or whatever, and 66% below 2.5 acres, then what can you do in a village? You have to go out. You have to seek a fortune elsewhere. But that is not everything. What is also happening is that there are many people who live in the village, even though they're immiserized and have a very poor agricultural backup, who live in the village and work in what is known as non-farm employment.
Which would be what, for example?
All kinds of things, like part-time bricklayer, part-time carpenter, part-time earth mover, part-time coolie,
But this is pretty much at a subsistence level, right?
Very much so. I mean, just to make ends meet. Now, the numbers of households that are in rural non-farm employment, it's really quite staggering. But almost half, 45.5% of the net rural product, rural net domestic product.
Right.
45.5% of the rural net domestic product is non-agricultural. Because in the village, practically half the economic operations take place outside of agriculture. In some parts of India, like in the north and some parts of West India, almost 55 to 60% of rural households are non-agricultural.
These are staggering changes, really, from these reality that people thought existed. How well is all of this understood at the political level, at the level of governance?
Now, I've gone and sung this song to a large number of people in power and those who are in the vicinity of power, shall we say. And again, the same story. They might accept what I'm saying in part, but not the whole. And when it comes to the whole, these same old formulations are trotted out. Like we need.
But is that a reluctance to accept that? It is a reluctance to accept the truth of the situation. But then one wonders why. I mean, what?
I think it's also a matter of cognitive dissonance. Most of these people have grown up, and have been told that what you need to do in a village is land reform. But there's no land to be reformed any longer.
Right.
But this reality, I think there is some hesitation in accepting it. To believe again that large landowners aren't sort of parading around, strutting about, is also kind of a mental block.
Is this as true of the academic as political class? I mean, among your colleagues, do you find acceptance of this reality?
Well, at the academic level, again, as I said, there's some people who are really quite tuned in, and I'm thinking of primarily the agricultural economists. They seem to know the situation quite well.
Right.
And I've learned a lot from them. They might focus on this or that village, or maybe a region. But what they probably lack is an understanding of India, because they don't travel that much. And what I thought would be useful in this context is to take their studies forward, and I do acknowledge their work, and see to what extent this is an all-India phenomenon and not just in this region or that region.
I see. In the regions in which you have studied this, I'm curious about what this has done to pre-existing social relations. Whereas at one time there obviously was a big landowning class, or I don't know how numerically large it was, but it was certainly powerful. But those relationships must have changed. I mean, you have are the small landholders also politically vocal?
Yes, they've changed a lot, especially if we look at the caste order. The change is most striking there. And following from that, the changes in the political alignment of different communities in the village.
Give me an example of that.
For example, there was a time when a village landlord could crack his whip and order his liegemen to vote for this or that party or candidate. And that is why the term vote bank, was quite current in India. So if I were able to tap the right person, then I was quite confident in getting a whole bunch of votes,
Right.
And the voters didn't have to know who they were voting for.
They knew who they were ordered to.
They knew who they ordered to vote for. Now that kind of thing held more or less. It wasn't quite absolute as I'm mentioning it to you, but it was quite a trend. One couldn't ignore it. Also, there was a kind of a vertical integration in the village, and the landlord dictated the terms of this integration. Or the powerful oligarchs, not just one landlord, there were probably 3 or 4 families, or sometimes 8 or 9 families, and they dictated the terms and which kind of hierarchy would be actually exercised on the ground. So they always put themselves number 1 and everybody else after that. And while the so-called lower caste people may have objected, they couldn't object too loudly. And so much of the lower caste, myths about themselves and their origin, and the anguish about the present conditions, these things were usually talked about within their hamlets in close quarters, but never outside.
Expressed publicly.
Because that would invite trouble.
Right.
But now when there are no large landlords and you can't give me a job, you can't give the poor person a job on your land, you can't engage him for more than a month at the most in a year, then why should this poor person listen to us, why should he pay attention to your swagger?
Oh, he certainly should not. I mean, there's every reason not. But does that lead to the poor person then organizing a political voice of their own?
Exactly. So that is what led to a large number of very strident scheduled caste movements. Scheduled caste
means
are the ex-untouchables who were listed in the schedule of the Constitution of India when India became independent, so that there could be special dispensation in their favor. Somewhat like your affirmative action, except that in our case we have reservations. Seats are reserved for them in education institutions and in government jobs. So we call them scheduled caste now. We don't use the earlier pejorative term like untouchable or whatever. And these scheduled castes have now become quite strong politically because they're no longer constrained economically.
But there seems to me, or could it be, that because they perceive their own situation, they understand it, they have taken the next step to forming their political voice and expression, this will in turn lead to getting the attention of the politicians to the reality as it is now. In other words, things may, from this very pressure, come to be more realistic for them.
Yes, but the politicians, as far as I can tell, are not interested in shall we say, fundamental changes. Most of these scheduled caste people don't want to stay in the village because they don't own land. You see, and there's no point in giving them land, because land that they'll get probably because of this redistribution will be very, very poor land, poor quality land. Most of these people want to get out of the village. Scheduled caste or not scheduled caste, this is the general ambition that most villagers have.
To go to the town?
How can I get out of the village?
To go to the town, to go to the city.
Yeah, go to the slum. The slums are sites of hope, not of hopelessness or despair, as we view it from outside. If you go to a slum, you'll find these people are very hopeful of tomorrow.
Yeah, that's an interesting point right there. The extent to which people leave the village for the town, it's not always just economic, is it? I mean, there's a bright lights fascination. Is there a kind of a sense of excitement about what may be possible in the city?
And also the hope for the future. In the village, you're sort of in a dead-end game. There's nothing going to happen to you tomorrow. And tomorrow will be as dull as today, if not worse. Whereas in the cities, there's a chance. And this is what they want. The thing also is that, in the village, there is no money, no income. And so these people, eke out a living by doing all kinds of non-farm employment jobs. And you might be misled if you were to conduct a survey and you were to ask people, what do you do for a living? And he might say, I'm a farmer. But you will sit down with him later on and ask him, well, what did you do today? Where do you get your money from today? You'll find that he did a number of jobs, and farming wasn't one of them. And then you ask him, why did you say farmer? And slowly you realize he said farmer because that's the only job he really knows. But that's not the only job he does.
This is fascinating, and a number of questions arise in my mind. One of them immediately is this. What then becomes a kind of reasonable governmental policy response to this? I mean, do you, to use the phrase in vogue here, try to keep them down on the farm, or do you do something
No, I don't
else?
think there's any point in keeping them down on the farm, because that is not going to work, and they don't want it either. There is some purchase to be had in getting them into cultivating cash crops, but that is also fraught with all kinds of danger. Cotton, for example, we found that those who grow cotton are also prone to committing suicides because the kind of loans they take, to grow cotton.
Say that again.
Suicide.
Suicide happens because of the loans are too oppressive for them to pay?
And this is it's almost become a pandemic in village India. In Andhra Pradesh and Punjab and Haryana, some of the more prosperous areas of India, where the farmer feels that, if he can somehow get this crop to work, then he'll have wiped out debts of several years. And then it doesn't work for some reason or the other. And cotton is a very mercurial crop.
Right.
Because,
and then despair sets in.
Exactly. And then you don't know what to do. And the money lender is knocking at your door, and the humiliation of it all. And so some people take this drastic step and commit suicide. And that's a pretty prevalent trend, and in India we are talking about it a great deal. So anyhow, so cash crop is one, but it's not a very dependable ally. So what do? I think there are two things that can be done. One is that we have to maintain our land records in a much more organized fashion. Today our land records are very, very sketchy.
This would tell us what? Who is on the land, what they're doing?
Who owns the land, who is the primary owner of the land, so that person can then transfer ownership rights without any problem.
Right.
Right now there are all kinds of things to be done, palms to be greased, etc., etc. So once you have all the land records properly in place, then the second thing is you might have to change a law which paradoxically was put in place to help the small farmer, but is now working against him.
Which is?
Because in the 50s, because at that time the Indian, soon after independence, the Indian state felt correctly that we must abolish feudalism, which some other countries in our neighborhood did not. Abolish feudalism and give land to the tiller. So if you till the land, you own the land.
That is the law as it existed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Unless, of course, you have very, very clear contractual agreements.
Okay.
And those contractual agreements tend to be a little, uncertain because land to the tiller law also remains. So if you keep a person on your land for too long, then the landowner gets a little worried whether this man will then, claim occupancy rights on the land.
Right.
But you see, what needs to be done is to firm up the small owners, ownership of the land, claim to the title to the land, so that he can then give the land over to a larger operator without any fear and move to the cities and get some work. But now what is happening
How would you do that, though? How would you support the small land, firm him up, so to speak? By what steps?
One is, I think, you have to change the law such that the land to the tiller law as it stands now has to be altered. And this can be done in conjunction with a proper recording of land ownership. And then the third step is that contract farming has to be also concretized and legalized. Right now, there are no laws on contract farming. So if I lease in land from you or if I lease out land from you, it's all by word of mouth.
Right.
And things are not worked out in a formal way, which is why most villagers will hang on to the handkerchief-sized plots, which are absolutely unremunerative. And the productivity is very low, and you can't convert agriculture into industry because of this reason.
I presume there is an agricultural ministry that is at least theoretically capable of all of this, the record keeping, the change in the law.
But it lacks political will.
It lacks political will.
It's not as if they don't know about it. Anybody who lives in the village or owns some land in the village, knows that these problems are all over, abound. But they lack the political will to do so. One major reason being that they don't have the kind of expertise on the ground, that tells them exactly what should be done.
To what extent is that, quote, political will diverted? The reason I mention this is my earlier reference to globalization. India is a fascinating country because everything we're talking about now coexists with a booming economy, with a country that's really being much talked about now as an emerging power, and with what we might call India's Silicon Valley economy. I understand that only involves maybe 3 million people. But is that getting the bulk of the government's attention? I'm sort of wondering if what all this reality you're talking about simply is not of interest because, or of less interest,
because the
focus is elsewhere.
Because they relate to people who are not like us.
Exactly, there you have it.
So you have 3 million people who get all the attention. And the growth charts that we read about are true, but they address only a small section of the population. 85% of all industrial workers in India, operate in units which employ 10 workers or less. Why is that so? Because these are the units on which there's no control and you cannot control. And the law doesn't help you control either. So these are basically sweatshops.
Right.
And most of the villagers who leave the village in search of jobs don't get a regular job in some big factory or the other. They get jobs in these places. As far as organized employment goes, it's been stagnant. For the last 25 years, it has not grown. Though the productivity has grown about 17 times, only the employment has not grown. If you look at cotton textile, which is very important, in the 1960s, India produced 5 billion square yards of cotton. Today, it produces 28 billion square yards of cotton, and this increases all from the small sector. The big factories are producing the same amount as they did in the past. So the bulk of this production, which goes for export and comes to this country and other countries, is from these sweatshops. And that is the link between village India, the ruination of the economy, and globalization. But you have another kind of link with the information technology, and these two are quite different.
Right.
Yeah? The only relationship the two have is that in both cases we're exporting cheap labor. One at the white collar level, the other at the, at the village level. But the number of people leaving the villages looking for jobs outside the village is phenomenal. And the number of people looking for jobs outside agriculture is even greater.
What is the price that India will pay if this situation is not resolved, if balance is not brought to this?
Well, I think
these different realities?
Yeah, see, of all the developing countries in the world, India is the only country where the service sector is way ahead of the manufacturing sector. And for a growing economy, that's not the way to go about doing it. So there are two things that might happen. One is that the whole thing may just crack under the strain, or B, there'll be two different economies proceeding in different directions.
But that's not viable, is it?
That's not
tenable.
It's not. Well, I don't know how long it'll last. Maybe it'll last my generation. But it's not something that I would bank upon for my children's generation.
You've mentioned, I've seen in some of the things you've written and the things other Indian scholars have written too, the term West-toxication.
Yes.
As at least to describe this kind of orientation, if you will, culturally and intellectually toward the West and away from Indian reality.
I picked up this term from an Iranian scholar. Iranian scholar had written this against the Shah. But I found this term very useful because in our country, as I look around me in the capital city of Delhi or Bombay or wherever, I see a large number of people who claim to be westernized. But when they relate to other people, they relate in a very old-fashioned, almost feudal fashion. And so I began to ask myself, is this westernization or what is it? Is it modernity or what? Because on the face of it, they look very modern. They dress in a modern fashion. They travel abroad all the time. They have all kinds of gadgets and gizmos. And yet when they talk to their servants, to their wives, to their children, to their underlings, it's as if the same old world hasn't changed by much. Some changes, yes, but not by much. The way the doctor relates to the patient, to the nurses, you can see it everywhere.
Right.
Which is why I thought that this particular term, West-toxication, fits the Indian condition rather neatly.
But it seems to me to be a barrier in itself to understand one's own reality.
It is. It is. Because, the people who are also quite well-read and should be better informed, they often believe in these popular myths like poor people produce these children because they have no other entertainment. And things like that, which absolutely not only are they insulting to the poor, they're grossly in error.
Right.
Or to believe that people vote on caste grounds. People do not vote on caste grounds. Leaders operate on caste grounds, the people don't. And why don't they do it? Because it's logically not possible. There are so many castes that even if I were a die-hard casteist, I wouldn't find a person from my caste.
To serve that interest.
Yes, to serve that interest.
If we brought this home, because you are an academic, you are a scholar and a writer, to the way in which people are educated to understand, what could we say about the academy, about the schools today? How are people being educated in India, young people obviously, to understand all the things that you've spoken about and the importance they have for
Well, in India, the school system in the public school, or what we call the government school system, is in great disarray. Nothing really gets done over there. Right. If you go to the villages where these schools predominate, you'll find that it is really a shame. There's nothing happening. The school teachers are sitting around. So one is really sad because there's so much talent going there untapped.
Right.
And the dropout rate is enormous. Half the kids drop out by the time they come to middle school. So you don't really get a kind of talent pool that you should have got given our country's size and population.
Does that suggest to, again, relating it to the problems we've been discussing, a kind of a national and perhaps even massive educational reform is necessary?
It is necessary.
And perhaps at every level, right?
Yeah, it is necessary at every level. For example, at the primary school level or to the high school level, you need to have teachers who provide quality education.
Right.
And then onwards, we go for research. In India, our research output is not really that much. In terms of research and development, the government's input has gone down in real terms, not in terms of proportion, by the way, in real terms. And I contrast that with America. And America is growing every year, the R&D that the government spends. I'm not talking about the private sector at all. So unless the government, and this is a complaint that Indians have made, a large number of Indians have made from time to time, and others who are not in India too, that unless we're able to do something about our public delivery of public goods, like education, health, and so forth, there are going to be serious problems for the poor people. 80% of all health expenditure in our country is out of pocket.
Mm.
So you can imagine the pressure on a poor person.
Absolutely,
you know?
absolutely.
70% or 73% of all expenditure on education is out of pocket.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you go to a village, it's actually moving, and it's a very moving sight, but it's something that I wouldn't want to happen. A small three-wheeler scooter rickshaw, they call them, you know,
Right.
parks itself in the middle of the village around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and from it, about 13 or 14 children emerge. You don't know how, I mean, I can't imagine how they could fit them all in. But they're children who go to private schools, but they're very poor children who go to poor private schools. You know, they wear a string tie and maybe barefoot too, you know, but they go there because parents feel if we can somehow, you know, tighten a belt or notch or two, we can send our kid to a school, private school, because public schools just don't work. And now, given the uncertainty of village life, most of these people think that if I can get my child an education, there's a future out there.
You know, that is absolutely, that's emotionally touching, even as you hear it, that degree of aspiration exists in the minds of the parents, and they're willing to sacrifice for the children. But I think your point is that until the government can better deliver the services,
Yes.
it's going
At
to be
all levels, from primary level to the you know, institutes of higher education.
right.
You know, in terms of per thousand population, we rank below Philippines, 5 times less than Philippines has. So we have to work on all these fronts.
These, indeed, and Dipankar, I want to thank you immensely because you've alerted me and I think educated everyone watching to how many fronts there are and what their implications are. And I'm particularly struck by, I think the underlying messages here for the government and those who wish to lead India to get out into the field and see the reality and do something about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My pleasure. And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHZ Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhzworldview.org. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching this week. Dipankar, thank you. That was magnificent, man. That's what we do.